A stone face, 11 feet tall, weighing as much as a loaded semi-truck, buried nose first in Mexican mud for 3,000 years, and the people who found it in 1862 looked at it and refused to believe their own eyes. Not because the face was strange. Because of who they assumed could never have carved it. That single wrong assumption didn't just survive for 2 centuries. It got recycled, repackaged, and handed down generation after generation, right up until researchers started feeding every scrap of data we have, the isotopes, the genomes, the excavation records, the carving styles, into modern analysis tools built to catch patterns a human eye keeps missing. And what came back wasn't a twist. It wasn't aliens, it wasn't a lost continent, it wasn't a secret transatlantic voyage. It was worse than that, in a way. It was confirmation, cold and total, that we had the answer sitting in the ground the entire time, and simply couldn't accept it. 17 of these heads exist. They sit today in the humid lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, half swallowed by red clay and jungle root. Each one was cut from a single block of basalt, no seams, no smaller stones fitted together, just one continuous piece of volcanic rock shaped into a face. The smallest stands about 6 feet tall. The largest tops 11 feet, and weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 tons. And every single one of them is different. Not stylized copies of a generic king. Not a repeated mask. Distinct individuals, with their own brow lines, their own mouths, their own particular set of the jaw. Look at 2 side by side and you will not confuse one for another, any more than you'd confuse 2 photographs of 2 different men. That detail, the individuality of the faces, is the whole reason this story exists at all, because it forced a question nobody could avoid: if these are portraits, then portraits of whom? And for a long stretch of history, the answer people reached for said far more about the people answering than it did about the stone. To understand how we got there, you have to go back to the civilization that actually made them, a civilization that rarely gets the credit it deserves even now. Around 1500 BCE, on the swampy floodplains along Mexico's Gulf Coast, a society began to take shape that historians would later label the Olmec, a name borrowed centuries after the fact from an unrelated Nahuatl-speaking people, since we have no idea what the original inhabitants called themselves. This wasn't a handful of villages. This was the first complex civilization in the history of the Americas: planned ceremonial centers, earthen pyramids, drainage systems, monumental art, and, this is the part that tends to get buried, a religious and symbolic vocabulary that every later Mesoamerican civilization would go on to borrow. The Olmec heartland grew around a sequence of major centers. San Lorenzo rose first, flourishing from roughly 1200 BCE, and it's there that most of the colossal heads have been found. La Venta followed, with its enormous earthen pyramid and elaborate ritual offerings buried beneath the plaza floor. Tres Zapotes carried the tradition into its later phase. Around 400 BCE, for reasons still debated among archaeologists: shifting river courses, environmental pressure, internal political upheaval, or some combination of all 3, the great Olmec centers were largely abandoned, and the jungle reclaimed what had been built. But here's the thing that gets lost in the shorthand: the Olmec didn't vanish so much as they diffused into everything that came after them. The Maya calendar system has roots that trace back to Olmec innovations. The recurring gods of rain, maize, and the feathered or plumed serpent that show up across 1,000 years of Mesoamerican religion, from the Olmec were jaguar motif, all the way to Aztec cosmology, didn't spring up independently in a dozen separate cultures. They were inherited, generation after generation, from a source most of those later cultures didn't even remember. And then there's writing. A stone slab called the Cascajal block, dated to roughly 900 BCE, and discovered in the early 2000s near the Olmec heartland, carries 62 carved symbols arranged in patterns that look deliberately linguistic, sequences, repetitions, the structural fingerprints of an actual script rather than decoration. If that interpretation holds, and most specialists who've studied it think it does, the Cascadel block represents the earliest known writing anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Independently invented. Not borrowed, not imported, not seeded by contact with some old illiterate civilization across an ocean. Homegrown, the way writing was homegrown in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt, and in ancient China, a handful of places in all of human history where people invented the idea from nothing. Consider what was actually buried at La Venta, because it tells you something about how deliberate this culture was. Beneath the main plaza, excavators found layered offerings of polished jade celts, mosaic pavements assembled from serpentine blocks, and figurine caches arranged with obvious ritual intent, buried, covered over, and never meant to be seen again by human eyes once the work was done. That's not the behavior of a loosely organized farming settlement. That's the behavior of a society, with a priestly or royal class wealthy and organized enough to dedicate enormous resources to acts of pure religious symbolism, with no practical payoff except the maintenance of cosmological order, as they understood it. That's the civilization behind the heads. Not a footnote. Arguably the root system beneath an entire hemisphere's worth of later achievement. So why did it take 200 years to say plainly, the Olmec carved these, and the faces are Olmec faces? It started with an accident. In 1862, on a plantation near what's now Tres Zapotes, a farm worker clearing land struck something hard beneath the soil. He assumed it was an overturned cooking cauldron. What he eventually uncovered was a colossal stone face, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, a helmet-like headdress. Word reached a Mexican antiquarian named José Melgar y Serrano, who came to examine it. And when he looked at that face, shaped by a civilization he knew almost nothing about, he reached for the explanation his own era had trained him to reach for. He declared the features Ethiopian, insisting the face reflected African ancestry, and concluded that the sculpture must reflect some contact with Africa rather than the skill of the indigenous people living in the region around him. There was no evidence behind that claim. No artifacts pointing toward transatlantic contact, no shared material culture, nothing. What existed instead was an assumption baked so deep into 19th-century colonial thinking that it didn't even register, as an assumption, the belief that indigenous American peoples were incapable, on their own, of producing monumental art of this sophistication. It wasn't a reading of the stone. It was a reading of the observer. And here's the frustrating part, that idea should have quietly died the moment real archaeology got involved. Instead it lingered, drifting out of scholarly journals and into popular and fringe literature, gaining a strange kind of second life, surviving the rise of professional archaeology, surviving the maturing of anthropology as a discipline, surviving the eventual arrival of genetic sequencing and isotope chemistry, tools that could have tested the claim directly, and when they finally were applied, did exactly that. The real turn came in the 1930s, when American-led archaeological expeditions began systematically excavating the Olmec heartland for the first time, not chasing a mystery to explain away, but doing the patient, unglamorous work of digging, cataloguing, and dating what they found. They uncovered more heads, plus altars, thrones, jade carvings, and enough stratified material to start building a real chronology. And the dates that came back reordered the entire timeline of Mesoamerican history. The Olmec weren't a late, derivative culture. They were early, earlier than the Maya, earlier than anyone previously credited with founding Mesoamerican civilization. They weren't recipients of ideas from somewhere else. They were the source. In all that careful field work, not one professional excavation ever produced supporting evidence for a transatlantic African origin. Not because archaeologists refused to look, they looked, extensively, but because it simply wasn't there. What was there instead was a self-contained, internally consistent civilization that explained its own monuments on its own terms. Now here's where the modern evidence closes the loop, and where a fair, non-sensational look at what the data says actually lands. Facial variation in human populations is continuous, not categorical. Broad noses, full lips, heavy-set features, these occur naturally and commonly across indigenous Mesoamerican populations and always have. 19th century racial taxonomy tried to sort human faces into rigid boxes, assigning a fixed meaning to a nose width or a lip shape, as if those features belonged exclusively to one population on Earth. Human biology has never actually worked that way, and no serious physical anthropologist today would try to assign ancestry from a single facial feature in isolation. When physical anthropologists studied the range of facial features on the Olmec heads statistically, they consistently found them falling well within normal indigenous Mesoamerican variation, not exotic, not anomalous, simply human variation, as it naturally occurs in that population. It also matters that these are sculptures, not photographs. Olmec artists worked within a specific artistic convention: broad, flattened faces, thick lips, almond-shaped eyes, distinctive cleft or crossed motifs on some headdresses. That shows up consistently across Olmec art in general, not just on the colossal heads. Jade figurines, ceramic infants, and carved reliefs from the same culture share that same stylistic language. That's evidence of a shared artistic tradition being applied deliberately to portraiture, the same way any culture's art has its own conventions for rendering the human face. Reading that stylistic convention as evidence of a foreign ethnicity mistakes the grammar of the art for the identity of the subject. Then there's the chemistry. Strontium isotopes, absorbed into human teeth from local food and water during childhood, leave a geographic signature that stays locked into the enamel for life. When researchers analyzed skeletal remains recovered from Olmec sites for strontium isotope ratios, the results pointed to local origin. These individuals grew up drinking the water and eating the maize of that specific region. Not visitors. Not long-distance travelers. Locals. And then genetics, which is really the part that settles the question at the population level. Modern and ancient DNA studies across the Americas have built an increasingly detailed picture. Indigenous American populations descend from groups that crossed from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge over roughly the last 15,000 plus years. Across a large and growing body of ancient and modern indigenous American genomes, there is no African genetic signature showing up in pre-Columbian indigenous American DNA. If a transatlantic African population had mixed into Olmec society at the scale that would explain 17 monumental royal portraits, you'd expect to see some trace of it in the genetic record. That trace has never appeared. Stack all of that up, the facial statistics, the isotope chemistry, the population genetics, the century of stratified archaeology, and you get 4 separate scientific approaches, each using different data, different labs, different methods, converging on the same conclusion. That kind of agreement across independent disciplines is about as strong as historical evidence gets. And yet the African origin claim didn't stay buried. It resurfaced in the 1970s in a very different form, and with a very different motive. A published book of that era revived the idea, this time framed not as colonial condescension, but as an act of historical reclamation, an attempt to write African achievement back into a global history that had spent centuries erasing it. The emotional logic behind that motivation is genuinely understandable. The erasure of African contributions from world history is real and well documented elsewhere. But when scholars went back and actually checked the sources cited in that argument, they found selective quotation, claims stretched well past what the underlying evidence supported, and conclusions the data simply didn't hold up. And that's where something genuinely striking shows up, something worth sitting with rather than rushing past. 2 arguments, separated by more than a century and built from opposite emotional motives, one from contempt, one from a wish for restorative justice, arrived at the exact same structural move. Both looked at a Mesoamerican achievement and, instead of crediting the people who actually built it, reached across an ocean to hand the achievement to someone else. Different intentions. Identical erasure. The people who lived on that land, coordinated that labor, and carved those faces got written out of their own story twice, for opposite reasons. Because make no mistake about what actually happened here, and it doesn't need any outside help to be extraordinary. The basalt used for the heads came from the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range roughly 60 miles from San Lorenzo, where most of the heads have been recovered. 60 miles of rainforest, river crossings, and swamp that turns to near-impassable mud in the wet season. The Olmec had no wheeled vehicles for transport, no horses, no oxen, no draft animals of any kind, none existed anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. No iron. No bronze. No metal tools whatsoever. Every stage of this, quarrying multi-ton basalt blocks, moving them across that terrain, and then carving individualized human faces into them, was accomplished with stone tools, wooden rollers, fiber rope, river rafts, and coordinated human labor on a massive scale. The leading reconstruction has the blocks floated by raft wherever rivers allowed and dragged the rest of the way over log rollers by teams of workers pulling in careful, sustained coordination. Picture what that actually requires on the ground, clearing a path through dense forest ahead of the stone, laying and relaying wooden rollers as the block inches forward, keeping hundreds of laborers fed and organized over what would have been weeks. And doing all of it across terrain that turns to thick, sucking mud for a large part of the year. That is not a curiosity. That's a demonstration of a society capable of organizing, feeding, and directing enormous coordinated labor forces toward a single monumental goal. A genuine engineering and logistical achievement, accomplished with nothing but rope, timber, stone, and human muscle. And the faces themselves, once you set aside 2 centuries of misreading, tell you exactly what they were always telling you. You don't move a 50-ton stone 60 miles through swamp to honor a stranger, and you don't do it to depict an abstract idea. You do it to honor someone who held real power, a ruler, a founder, a figure whose people considered him worth an almost